SECfans.com. Another one for the Fighting Irish Notre Dame fans. Going to talk about your team and going to talk about Stanford. This is the second time we've talked about Stanford this year as well. I swear we're not just SEC fans. We get outside the SEC every week. This time we got outside the SEC twice this week because the SEC slate is really bad. So for those of y'all who are new to our channel, please hit that subscribe button. And those of you who aren't new to our channel and haven't subscribed yet, hit my head on the mic, please hit that subscribe button as well. I think you'll find us to be rather objective for a couple of SEC guys. No Pac-12 or independent hate here. Just want to get nerdy about both of your teams and look and see what the data says, and maybe we can glean something from that to predict a winner in this game. All right, talked about Notre Dame a lot this year already. Gonna talk about them again. We didn't love what we saw coming out of the Vanderbilt game. We talked about how Ball State was probably a tune-up game, and then we saw in the Vanderbilt game that not only were we disappointed at quarterback, and Wimbush just really couldn't get that offense going, and he's now been replaced by Ian Book. I didn't love the pass defense in that game. And the combination of KJ Costello and Arcega-Whiteside in this one is got to scare you a little bit if you're a Notre Dame fan and you saw Kyle Shermer sort of tear you up. And I know, again, they didn't give up a ton of points, but they had a couple of drives that stopped crazy on the 1 yard line or close to scoring in that game. So putting Stanford aside for a second and just addressing Notre Dame to this point, are you a little bit, and also put Ian Book to the side a second, are you a little bit worried about this Notre Dame defense?
I am, and I didn't think Vanderbilt was a great team. We did a video on it. We both predicted that Notre Dame would win fairly comfortably, and I think the comment from both of us, quite frankly, was if Notre Dame didn't win by a comfortable margin, that was probably going to be a little bit of an indictment on Notre Dame more than anything. And I will add to that, the Wake Forest game didn't necessarily make me any more confident. They won that game 56-27, and that's a good win. I get that, but statistically, Wake Forest is looking like they might be a really terrible team. I mean, they opened the season against Tulane and had 7.5 yards per attempt, and then they beat up on Towson. But the week prior against Boston College, they threw for 4.8 yards per attempt. So Notre Dame holding them at 4.5 yards per attempt. Sure, that's great and wonderful, but again, both really on both sides of the ball, it's kind of interesting. A little bit better, just a touch better than Boston College in terms of the passing defense Notre Dame showed, and then also passing offense. 9 yards per attempt is actually worse than Boston College had averaged against Wake Forest. They had over 12 yards per attempt. So I think a lot of what happened in that game was really a reflection of really how suspect Wake Forest is in a lot of ways. So I am concerned. I think the defense, I think they're solid and they should be pretty good. And the numbers back up the fact that they're pretty good, but they're not necessarily elite. And when, getting into the model a little bit, the numbers from Notre Dame, especially against the run, I will say the run has been very good. And even in the Vanderbilt game, it's not like Notre Dame was getting, necessarily pushed around in that game on the ground. The run defense was solid. Vanderbilt averaged only 3.5 yards per carry, and the stats reflect that. I think the concern is there's a little bit of a weakness in the passing game, not a huge one, and that's something that can be exploited.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about Ian Book switching in for Brandon Wimbush. One of the things that we often talk about is it's pretty rare. We see the freshman and I guess sophomore sensation with Tua and Trevor Lawrence at Clemson. We see them coming in and replacing incumbent guys. What you don't see a lot is a guy that's been a starter over another guy for a long time get replaced. There's always the joke that the backup quarterback's the most popular guy on the team, but usually that guy isn't starting for a reason. So if we're going to go step two, potentially not so cheery for Notre Dame, are there some warning signs that maybe this isn't the ultimate game changer at quarterback and that he was sitting on the bench for a reason, or maybe this is just the change they need?
Well, and there is, and it goes back to the statement I made before, that they put in Book in a game. They had good offensive production, but Wake Forest had just given up over 12 yards per attempt. They gave up 304 yards passing to Boston College, 64% completion percentage, 5 touchdowns to 0 interceptions. And that was 9 days before due to the scheduling quirk, but essentially a week before against Boston College. So it's not like Book came in and set the world on fire or he did anything that's particularly unexpected. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Wake Forest pass defense is quite poor. So you want to be careful what you can take from it. My big takeaway on the quarterback situation is essentially this. Wimbush, when he had Josh Adams back there and they're running the football and they had 2 first-round draft picks on the offensive line, was exceptionally difficult for teams to defend on the run. Most teams could not stop Notre Dame's run game. They ran all over USC, which is a game we predicted to happen last year. And because of that, he was extremely effective. What's happened is that Notre Dame's offense, really not due to Wimbush's fault, is struggling to move the ball at anywhere near the same clip. They don't have Adams in the backfield. I think more importantly, they don't have 2 first-rounders in the offensive line blowing people away. And because of that, teams are playing him more straight up, and he's struggling to throw the football. If they had the surrounding pieces where Wimbush could be a run-first player, I think he'd be pretty similarly successful to he was last year. He's struggling because he's having to be more of a particular passer. And what they're seeing from Wimbush is a lot more like really what you saw from him against LSU last year, against Miami last year, who had a much better front than they have this year, where he had to play as a traditional quarterback, and he's too inaccurate to do that. And he's just not great at running a traditional offense. He really needs to be doing RPO concepts against guys that are open because teams are overcompensating for the run. Ian Book, if you were in that style of offense you were running last year, I think Ian Book would be less successful because he's not the runner that Wimbush is, and he's not going to, that team was dominant running the ball consistently against most teams. The difference is without the ability to do that, when Wimbush can't win a game with his legs and he has to complete some throws, all of a sudden he starts getting exposed, and it's a weird thing that Ian Book becomes more successful.
All right, so and I think you're right. I think that one of the things that I will say, though, is if you don't have Josh Adams back there and you can't throw it, we get into a little bit of what we've seen with Jalen Hurts at Alabama, in that even if you have a good running game, but you can't keep a defense honest, it's problematic because they can stack the box. This is obvious stuff that everybody knows. They can load the box, and we saw that with Jalen Hurts. Sometimes, though, or I would say most of the time, if you have a highly recruited, well-coached team, you can neutralize that and get around that and still score some points. And it hides some of the deficiencies that you have at quarterback. And the example that we keep using is this game last weekend with Texas A&M and Alabama. Alabama wins this game 45-23 or whatever it was, and they scored 45 in the first 3 quarters and shut it down. That game, we talked about this offline, that game with Jalen Hurts at quarterback is 7 points, 4-point win for Alabama, something like that, maybe a pick 'em. That's how much difference a quarterback means to the entire rest of the offense. And Notre Dame has good wide receivers that aren't able to eat. They've got a decent, not elite running back and running game that can't open up because they don't have the quarterback to do it. So maybe Ian Book can do that. I am scared, and I'll give you another analogy or comparison, and maybe go just a minute on this. But you talked about Wake Forest and how the teams, their performance up to this point indicates that this might not be that big of a deal that they did well against Wake Forest. Talk about how we use this comparison of when Ed Orgeron took over the job for Les Miles and everybody elevated him to the guy they needed to hire, but the teams they face in terms of run defense, and that's where their offense was going, really set things up for him to look better than maybe he really was.
Right. So the point that Daniel's alluding to here is when Ed Orgeron took over as the interim coach in 2016, LSU was really struggling to move the football. And there was sort of been this big assumption that, it was Les Miles was the problem. They just lost a game against Auburn where, the clock ran out and they had a touchdown that would have won the game and wiped away. And all of a sudden, Ed Orgeron comes in as the interim coach. We're going to go back to running the football, and they were really successful. They ran the ball for 8 yards a carry, about 8 yards a carry average in the games after that. The problem was they played Missouri, Southern Miss, and Ole Miss. And that year, I think all three of them, I can't remember, was it it's like over, I know they were worse than like 100th nationally in rushing defense, all three of them. I mean, they were terrible teams. And the point we made is that it was pretty predictable that LSU was always going to run the ball for 8 yards a clip against those teams. But immediately after that set of 3 games, when, Ed Orgeron was the greatest thing since sliced bread, they played Alabama. They rushed for 1.2 yards per carry against Alabama. And they lost 10-0. And to the Jalen Hurts analogy, Alabama couldn't move the ball to save their life either. That run first, when you run that run spread offense with a running quarterback, it's really good as long as you can run the ball for about 6 yards per carry. And the moment you can't, all of a sudden tends to be extremely unsuccessful. Well, even with that, Alabama managed 10 points, won the game 10-0. 2 weeks later, then they, quote, rebounded against Arkansas, who was also terrible. And then they played Florida, and LSU lost that game 16-10. Point being, it pretty much entirely tracked with the quality of defenses they've played. So I think it's dangerous to make too many assumptions about quarterbacks or changes, because you come out of a game where, like the Vanderbilt game where you had a tough outing or you're playing a better team, and then you make the switch, you play a worse team. You generally want to be playing a worse team when you make the switch because you don't want to lose because you've made the switch. And all of a sudden, of course, the guy looks better because you played a team that, can't defend the pass worth of crap. The problem is that doesn't necessarily mean it's an indicator down the road. It may just be who you played. And I think Book is a bit of a gamer. I think he takes risks that Wimbush doesn't. That can be a good thing. I think it can also be a bad thing. It can lead to a lot more turnovers, which is probably why he hasn't played. I'll be curious to see what it's like. It played off of the LSU game. We talked about this before. He threw some jump balls in the LSU game that could have very easily gone the other way in that bowl game and lost them the game. But at least he gives them a chance to win, whereas Wimbush, honestly, he's been extremely inaccurate and ineffective, and I think he has regressed. So I do think Book is an improvement, but I just be cautious on how much of an improvement at this point.
So looking on the other side of this, we were pretty critical of Bryce Love in the first game. I think it was 1.7 yards per carry. He came back around against USC. We also noted that USC had a bad run defense, and that's proven out for the rest of this year so far. I still don't know what to make of this Stanford team. I think they're a good team that's probably not the 7th best team in the country. And Stanford fans probably aren't going to love that. But we both picked them to beat USC in the one game we did on them this year. I'm torn, and maybe you can help me out with this, because a lot of people are saying, okay, they got some lucky breaks against Oregon, and that's why they won that game. But I kind of want to point to, if I'm putting something in Stanford's positive category, I kind of want to point to the fact that the Georgia-Missouri game, where Georgia didn't do that great offensively, scored a lot of points because Missouri made a lot of unforced errors. And sometimes when you're the better team, those lucky unforced errors kind of happen because that overall pressure just makes it happen. So if we're going to take a step back and we're going to talk about this Oregon game and this win, is that a fair thing to say, or are you a little concerned coming out of the Oregon game?
And you talk about pressure, but I think it's a little more than that too. I've often made the comment in the SEC circles, 2007 LSU's national title is one of the weirdest things to happen nationally in the past 20, 30 years in college football. That you had a 2-loss LSU team win that national title, and they went for it on 4th down. I forget the number of times that season. I think they were successful in every single one of them. They threw a deep pass to beat Auburn. I think it was like 5 seconds on the clock, where if that pass had been bobbled and gone out of the back of the end zone, they would have lost the game, even though they were in chance to kick a field goal to win it. A lot of crazy things. The opinion that I have on that is LSU was, quote, lucky because they were talented. They were lucky on that deep pass against Auburn because they had a great receiver that went up and catch the ball. They were lucky on a lot of their special teams plays because they had elite talent on their special teams units. They were able to help them make the plays. Same way against Georgia. Georgia, South Carolina, ball gets a guy in the face. Dan Bailey catches it, runs it back. All these fumble returns and whatnot, they're the result of the fact that you have defenders that are fast, that swarm to the football, that capitalize on plays. Tipped balls turn into interceptions because you have athletic guys that can make a play on the ball in space. it's kind of the NFL effect. Any mistake gets magnified because of the ability of the guys on the other side to make a play on the ball. They're all playmakers. And when you talk about pressure, I think the pressure that Stanford puts on you is the fact that Stanford is a very well-coached team that capitalizes on your errors. And, the fact that Oregon fumbles the football has a little bit to do with the fact that Stanford's physical and can cause you to fumble the football. So I think, like you said, there's something there. I think there's something to the fact that there's pressure. I think where pressure often comes into play is when a team feels like they need to make a play to win. And so the guy tries to run a little harder or a little longer than he should, fumbles the football. I think with the Missouri game, they had a tight end catch the ball, got stood up, and got stripped after about 2 seconds. Ideally, when you get stood up like that, you cover the ball and you get down so you don't get stripped. And that's where I think pressure affects you. But with Stanford, I think the biggest thing they do is they're physical, and frankly, in a conference that's not very physical. And because of that, a lot of guys just don't respond to it very well. They don't react. They fumble the ball, and they just have problems being hit for fourth quarters because they're not used to it.
Since we don't really know what to make of this Stanford team yet, why don't you show us the model and walk through it and tell us what the model makes of this Stanford team and this Notre Dame team so far?
So, first off, I'm not going to go into excruciating detail on how the model works. We have a video that we produced that goes into that kind of detail. But the short version of it is the model is a neutral model that generates an estimate of each team's production, basically relationally by looking how each team's produced against their opponents, how good their opponents are, and how their opponents did against everybody else to sort of gauge how good you are. Looks at your own tendencies versus the other team's tendencies, run to pass, and comes up with an estimated offensive production. And then the next step is that it builds a scoring model unique to your team based off how your team has done over the course of the season. In other words, I'm doing a multivariate analysis, or I have a multivariate curve that's generated for your team to create a scoring model that's unique to what your team has taken to score over the course of the season. Not linear, but how it scales, because different offenses scale in different ways. In this game, the current estimation really, both defenses are pretty good against the run. Stanford and Notre Dame. Notre Dame's defense is better than Stanford's, according to our model. I think that's probably something that would generally be agreed to. Notre Dame allowing 71% of opponent rush averages, which is excellent. 86% against the pass, which is also very good. Stanford against the run is good. 86% is not elite. You can hold teams to a low percentage of their average if you're a very good defense. It's much harder against the pass. But Stanford's actually allowing teams 100% of their passing averages. Actually a little more than that if I carry it out to a decimal. 8.1 yards per attempt allowed is pretty rough, frankly. So, how does that play out? Well, Stanford, because their offense has been more explosive, is expected to outgain Notre Dame, and this is kind of the story of the week. Yet again, even though Stanford's expected to outgain Notre Dame 5.9 yards per play to 5.5, Notre Dame does a better job of scoring off their yardage than Stanford does. So Notre Dame is predicted to win the game despite being outgained in a yard per play sense, not a total yard sense. Expected to win 28-20.
It's funny because so far, and since this is just the second week of our models, we've seen how so far this year the numbers have been pretty wacky, and they've been really big spreads, or they've been really high scores. I think the Ohio State model was in the 50s. So to see something that's closer to not talking about the spread or the team that it picked to win, to see something that's closer to what you'd mentally expect with these two teams in terms of like a final score, does that make you feel a little better about the model's predicted winner? Or do you think there could be just as much misinformation and bad data in a normal score model as any other?
I think there can be just as much misinformation. Part of the problem is, I don't like to run the model at all until week 4 because I want at least 3 games worth of data. Stanford's schedule makes this difficult for us this year, and the reason for that being we don't calculate FCS teams. So there's really only 3 games worth of data. It's really minor data points. Every little bit of aberrant data causes a problem. But I do feel better when you see something that makes sense. Obviously, that helps. It's always odd when I see one team expected to outgain in the other and still lose. But I think really the upside of that here is Stanford's rushing average not great this year. Okay, so as a general rule, when you're averaging 3.7 yards per carry, you're not great to start with. And Notre Dame's run defense has been very good and has consistently been good this season. So it's only predicting Stanford to have 2.6 yards per carry in this game. And if you told me that Stanford's only going to have 2.6 yards per carry, I would totally believe that they score 20 points or less. So that's really the data point that I think makes sense how it was derived, and then the score makes sense in view of that.
All right. So, given all that, why don't you go ahead and give me your score and your thoughts on it?
I think this game might actually be a little more one-sided than even this indicates. I'm going to pick Notre Dame 31-17. And the reason for that is I think really with Book, they're looking a little bit more effective than they were with Wimbush. And I know we spent some time earlier. It seemed like I was talking down Book. I was just essentially trying to hedge, or not even really hedging, but saying I wouldn't be going quite so fast off the Wake Forest game to think that this offense is completely turned around. But Wimbush had been straight up ineffective. And at some point, I think just the style of offense they were trying to run with him wasn't working. And they're going to be a little more productive. So I think the model's probably underrepresenting Notre Dame a little bit because I don't have any primacy or recency factors in the model. That's intentional. Again, anything like that, if I added that to the model, I would be putting my own bias to say how much does a recent game really matter versus an old game. I don't do that. I let the model completely generate its own internal variables so that we can use it as an objective baseline. So I think that's true. And I think if Stanford's only getting 2.6 yards per play, I know you pointed out Notre Dame's potential weaknesses in the secondary, but that's pretty rough. If Bryce Love is under 4 yards per carry again, I don't think, given the strength of Notre Dame's defense overall, that Costello is good enough or consistent enough to put up a lot of points.
So part of me wants to stick with Notre Dame because I've been pretty high on them this year, and I've actually been really high on them this year. But another part of me cannot get away from that Vanderbilt game. They had Vanderbilt at home, and Vanderbilt's not a good football team. And we saw 2 weeks later, Vanderbilt goes and plays South Carolina at their house, not at Williams-Brice, and Kyle Shermer throws like 4-something yards per carry or yards per attempt. Running backs 2.8 yards per carry. Really struggled against the South Carolina defense that we think is good but not great. I will say that Bryce Love now has had another not so amazing game. He was 4.7 yards per carry against Oregon, but Oregon is a sneaky good run defense. Go back and look at their numbers. I like the model in this one, but I like the teams reverse. Give me Stanford 28, Notre Dame 20, and I'm willing to admit part of this is because I am perpetually, permanently, and forever jaundiced by the notion that if someone is on the bench for a long time behind another guy, he was on the bench for a reason. Ian Book does take shots, but the plays he connects on that aren't 50-50 balls are a lot of dink and dunk, a lot of short stuff. I think Stanford plays good defense. I don't think the numbers reflect it. I'm going with the model, but against the model. 28-20 Stanford in this one.
Okay. I think it's a fair guess, and it's going to be interesting to see. And, as we talked about before, it's an interesting game because I really think at the end of the day, if Stanford wins this game, it's going to be extremely hard for Notre Dame to make the playoff picture. And if Notre Dame wins the game, based off the rest of their schedule, which is looking pretty weak, suddenly they have a shot to backdoor into the playoff, even if they're not a fantastic team, just because of the ease of schedule.
All right, real quick. If this game gets really high scoring, 30s or 40s, does that favor Stanford or Notre Dame?
I definitely think it favors Notre Dame because Stanford's offense is more predicated on possession, and I don't think they have a passing game that works by occasionally having a guy make a big play. But if they have to go out there and make a big shot after big shot and they have to force the issue, their offense is not built to do it. Notre Dame's is a little more dynamic.
All right, Stanford Notre Dame fans. Notre Dame fans were already used to our sort of overly negative tone throughout the show. Stanford fans are getting used to it. Look, you're ranked number 7 and number 8 in the country, so we're not going to sugarcoat it. You're not a 7-5 type team. You're trying to get in the playoffs, so we're going to pick you apart a little bit because we need to find those weaknesses to know how you would stack up against an Ohio State or an Alabama, because if you want to be in the playoffs, you're going to have to take some heat, some criticism from us. If you want to go 7-5, we'll kiss your butt a little bit and just make you happy. Anyway, Stanford fans, Notre Dame fans, thanks so much for hanging with us this long. Please remember to subscribe, and also remember we need your score. We need your MVP. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.